a lonely giant, being hunted by the whole town, until a petite widow became his shield. The remote logging town of North Pine was a place carved from timber and shadows, radiating a mood of harsh suspicion, deep-seated fear, and profound isolation. And, in a town that needed a villain, all eyes turned to the forest. They were coming for him, a posse with fire and rope, never suspecting that the gentle giant they were hunting was the only person who knew the truth. The town of North Pine was built on the bones of giants. Not men, but trees. Great ancient pines, whose stumps stood like moss-covered tombstones at the edge of town, a constant reminder of the wilderness that had been tamed and the one that had not. For the forest that still loomed dark and impenetrable on the slopes of the mountain held a giant of its own. They called him Ben. No one knew where he came from. He had simply appeared years ago, a hulking silhouette against the tree line, a man whose sheer size seemed an affront to the natural order of things. The loggers' men who wrestled with nature for a living spoke of him in hushed, nervous tones around the fire. They spoke of snapped saplings that no axe had touched, of footprints in the mud wide as a skillet. He was a ghost, a brute, a monster in the woods. The fear was a low-grade fever that never quite broke. In her small shop at the end of the town's only street, Amelia worked her needle through a tough piece of canvas, the scent of thread and beeswax a small comfort against the world outside. The door was open, letting in the sharp, clean smell of sawdust and the gossip of two women waiting for their mending. Jed saw him again last night, one whispered, her voice tight. Just a shadow, she said, but big as a barn door. Heading up toward the orphanage. Lord have mercy, the other clucked, pulling her shawl tighter. What's a beast like that want with orphans? Amelia's needle paused for a fraction of a second. Her face, a quiet oval of gentle resolve, revealed nothing. She had been a widow for 3 years, a silent fixture in a town of loud, hard men. She knew the language of fear. She also knew it was often just another word for ignorance. She finished her stitch, her lips a thin, unreadable line. Later that afternoon, she delivered a mended bundle of linens to the orphanage, a squat, joyless building at the edge of town. The matron, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face seemed permanently puckered from disapproval, accepted the bundle with a sniff. Thank you, Amelia. Though with the troubles we have, a few patched sheets hardly matter. She gestured with her chin toward a small boy huddled in the corner, clutching something to his chest. Another one of those appeared on the west windowsill this morning. I tell you, it's unnatural. The work of the devil meant to spook these poor, godless children. Amelia walked over to the boy. What do you have there, Thomas? She asked softly. The boy unfurled his small fist. Resting in his palm was a tiny, exquisitely carved wooden fawn, its head tilted with a lifelike curiosity. The detail was so fine, so full of a gentle spirit that it seemed to breathe. Amelia's heart ached. She gently stroked the smooth wood with her fingertip, a secret, knowing smile touching her lips for just a moment. It's not the devil's work, Mrs. Gable. She said, her voice clear and soft, though she was speaking more to the fawn than to the matron. It's a gift. Miles away, where the pines grew so thick they blotted out the sun. Ben sat on a 3-legged stool that groaned under his weight. His cabin was a testament to his immense size. The doorway was raised, the ceiling beams notched to accommodate his head, the bed a colossal platform of rough-hewn logs. It was a lonely kingdom built for one. In the corner on a makeshift shelf sat an entire forest of silent, waiting creatures. A bear rearing up a hawk with its wings unfurled, a fox curled asleep. Dozens of them, each one a small miracle of life captured in wood. The hands that made them were a paradox. They were huge, the knuckles scarred and thickened from a life of hard, unknown labor. They looked as if they could split a log with a single blow. But now those same hands held a sliver of birchwood with a reverence that was almost painful to behold. A tiny razor-sharp knife moved with impossible delicacy, shaving off curls of wood thin as paper. He was carving a new gift. A hummingbird, its wings a frozen blur of motion. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his breathing slow and even. The fierce, brutish monster from the town's dark imagination was nowhere to be found. In his place was only this: a lonely artist, a silent giver of gifts. He worked until the light failed, until the figure in his hands was perfect. He set it gently on the shelf with the others, his creation complete. He rose and walked to the single grimy window of his cabin. Far below, the lights of North Pine began to flicker on a constellation of warmth he could see but never touch. He placed a massive hand against the cold glass, his breath fogging the pane, a solitary giant watching a world that had locked him out, never knowing that the only thing he wanted was to find a way in. The night in North Pine was a creature of sharp, cold stars and the deep, resonant silence of the forest. Lamplight from Amelia's window spilled a lonely golden rectangle onto the dusty street. Inside, her needle danced a tiny silver fish, weaving a seam on a logger's heavy coat. It was late. The rest of the town was asleep, but Amelia often worked into the small hours the rhythmic pull of thread through fabric, a comfort, a meditation against the quiet ache of her own solitude. Her thoughts, as they often did, drifted to the woods, to the myth the town had created and the truth she suspected. She remembered the flawless craftsmanship of the fawn, the impossible delicacy born from a man they called a brute. The town saw a monster in the shadows. She saw a mystery, and tonight a restless curiosity pulled at her stronger than any fear. She finished her work, banked the fire, and slipped out into the cold. She told herself it was just for a breath of air, but her feet carried her away from the sleeping town and toward the dark, looming wall of the forest, toward the orphanage that stood sentinel at its edge. She kept to the shadows, a ghost in her own right. And then she saw him. A shape detached itself from the deeper darkness of the pines, immense and silent. It was Ben. He moved with a strange, heavy grace, his massive form not crashing through the undergrowth, but seeming to part it to move with it. He carried no axe, no weapon. He clutched something small in one of his great hands. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of fear and fascination. This was the moment the town whispered of in terror. She watched breathless as he approached the orphanage. He moved to the west-facing window, the one where the little boy had found the fawn. He paused, looking around his head, turning as if sensing every shift in the night wind. Then, with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man of his size, he reached up and placed his small precious cargo on the sill. A newly carved hummingbird, its wings a perfect frozen blur. He lingered for only a second, a giant leaving a gift fit for a fairy tale, then turned and melted back into the forest, leaving only the whisper of his passage. Amelia leaned against the rough bark of a pine tree, her legs weak. He wasn't a monster. He was a secret keeper, a lonely soul, speaking the only language he had left, the language of wood and beauty and silent acts of grace. The injustice of it all settled in her heart, sharp and cold. The next day she acted. She could not speak to him, for that would shatter the fragile peace of his anonymity and perhaps frighten him away forever. So she would answer him in his own language. She took a sturdy wool shirt from her charity pile, one she'd found snagged and abandoned near the forest's edge months ago. Its size so immense it could only belong to one man. Her needle, a flash of silver, worked to mend the tear, not just functionally, but beautifully, with a fine, almost invisible stitch. Then she baked a loaf of bread, its warm, yeasty scent filling her small home with a feeling of comfort. She wrapped the bread in the neatly folded shirt in a clean linen cloth. With her heart pounding, she walked to the edge of the woods to an old, flat-topped boulder that marked the beginning of a faint animal trail she suspected was his. It felt like crossing a forbidden border. She placed the bundle on the stone, a small white offering to the spirit of the forest. Then she turned and walked away, not looking back. Ben found it 2 days later. He saw the white bundle from a distance, and his first reaction was suspicion. A trap. The townspeople were clever with their cruelty. He circled it warily, his eyes scanning the trees. But there was no glint of a rifle barrel, no scent of man on the wind. He finally approached and with cautious fingers unwrapped the cloth. He stared. A loaf of bread, still faintly warm. And a shirt. His shirt. He ran a massive thumb over the mended tier. The stitches were perfect, a tiny, intricate miracle of thread. It was the work of a professional, of the seamstress, the widow. A wave of emotion so powerful it made him dizzy washed over him. Someone knew. Someone had seen his secret. And they had not responded with torches and pitchforks. They had responded with bread and a mended shirt, with kindness. A kindness so profound and unexpected it felt like the sun on his face after a lifetime in shadow. He gathered the bundle to his chest as if it were a holy relic and carried it back to his cabin. That night, he did not eat the bread. He simply sat at his table, looking at it, at the impossible neatness of the stitches on his shirt. He touched the mend again, tracing the path of Amelia's needle, a silent conversation passing between his calloused finger and her careful hand. A thread of kindness had been extended from her world into his. He looked over at his workbench at a pristine block of pale yellow aspen. His hands, which had felt so clumsy and huge just days before now, felt purposeful. The hummingbird had been for the children. This next one would be his reply. This one would be for her. A silent conversation bloomed between the town and the forest. It was a language of gifts. Amelia would leave a warm, crusty loaf of bread or a small pot of jam on the flat stone at the wood's edge, and a day or two later, a new marvel would appear on the orphanage windowsill. A stoic, noble-looking wolf. A tiny perfect rabbit, its ears cocked as if listening. The children cherished these wooden treasures, and Amelia cherished the secret correspondence, a fragile bridge of kindness built across a chasm of fear. For a few weeks, a quiet peace settled in her heart. The town of North Pine remained a place of hard edges and harder gossip. But she now had a secret garden of her own, a knowledge that there was a gentle soul hidden in the wilderness. The fear for his discovery was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her days, but the joy of their connection was a quiet, defiant song. That song was brutally silenced on a Tuesday. The day had begun like any other with the scream of the sawmill and the rhythmic ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Then came a new sound, a sound that cut through the mundane clamor of the town like a bolt of lightning. The frantic, desperate ringing of the town's emergency bell. It was a sound reserved for fire or disaster. People spilled from the saloon and the mercantile, their faces etched with alarm. The work stopped. A sudden terrible silence fell, filled only by the frantic clang, clang, clang of the bell. Word spread like a prairie fire on a dry wind. A child was missing. It was Daniel, the 10-year-old son of Marcus Croft, the formidable foreman of the logging company. Croft was a man who ruled the town through a mixture of payrolls and intimidation, a man whose worldview was as rigid and unyielding as the tall pines his men felled. He prized order above all, and his son was a wild, unruly sapling he could never quite tame. Amelia's heart went cold. She stood in the doorway of her shop, a half-mended shirt clutched in her hand. A small group had gathered around a frantic-looking teenager, the last person to have seen the boy. He was chasing a rabbit. The boy stammered, his eyes wide with fear. I told him not to told him Mr. Croft would tan his hide, but he just laughed and ran. Ran toward the deep woods. He pointed a trembling finger toward the mountain, toward the forest, toward Ben's home. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. A murmur of old fears, of dark superstitions began to ripple through them. All eyes turned from the boy to the dark, silent wall of trees. Marcus Croft shouldered his way through the crowd. His face, usually red with authority, was a pale, tight mask of parental terror. When he heard the words "deep woods," his terror found a target, and it curdled instantly into rage. The woods, he roared, his voice shaking. He spun around, his wild eyes finding every fearful face in the crowd. By his cabin, that beast has my son. The accusation, once spoken aloud by a man of his standing, became truth. The town's simmering fear had found its name. The low hum of prejudice exploded into a battle cry. It was the monster. It had to be the monster. "He's taken the boy," a woman shrieked. "God only knows what he's doing to him," another man shouted. The panic was a contagion. It swept through the street, transforming worried neighbors into a single-minded entity of righteous fury. A mob. Men ran for their homes, emerging moments later with squirrel rifles and old army pistols. The blacksmith, his face grim, distributed torches from his workshed. The flickering premature light cast long, dancing demonic shadows against the storefronts. Amelia watched in horror. This couldn't be happening. They didn't know him. They didn't know the gentle soul who could carve the soul of a hummingbird into a piece of wood. "Mr. Croft," she cried, running forward, her voice a desperate plea against the tide of their anger. "Wait, you can't know this. Ben would never harm a child." Croft turned on her, his eyes blazing. "Ben!" he spat, seizing on her use of his name. "You speak of that animal as if you know him. Have you been consorting with that thing, Amelia? You're a lonely widow. Your mind is soft with grief. You don't understand the evils that live in the dark." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Get out of the way, woman. This is men's business." She was shoved aside, a small, helpless stone in the path of an avalanche. She saw the faces of the men she had known her whole life, men whose shirts she had mended, whose children she had watched grow, and she did not recognize them. Their eyes were filled with a righteous, terrifying fire. They were not neighbors anymore. They were hunters. The mob began to move. A river of fire and iron, it flowed from the main street and began the slow, determined march up the path toward the forest, toward the home of her silent friend. Amelia stood alone in the empty, dust-choked street, the sounds of the mob, their angry shouts, the metallic click of rifles being checked, growing fainter as they were swallowed by the trees. The sun was beginning to set, and the woods that had been a place of quiet mystery were now a hunting ground. The shadow of fear, once just a whisper in the pines, had become a ravenous living thing. And it was going to devour the kindest man she had ever known. She clutched the unfinished shirt in her hand, her knuckles white, her heart a cold, hard knot of terror. She was utterly, hopelessly alone. The mob moved through the forest like a single, many-legged beast, its heart a furious collective drumbeat. Torches painted the ancient pines in strokes of angry orange, casting monstrous dancing shadows that twisted and lunged with every step. The woods, which had been a place of quiet mystery, was now a cathedral of fear, and they were its righteous crusaders. They were not loggers or blacksmiths or farmers anymore. They were a posse, a righteous tide of fire and iron rolling toward the darkness to slay the dragon that haunted their town. Every snapped twig was the sound of a bone breaking. Every hoot of a distant owl was the cry of a stolen child. Their fear fed their rage, and their rage burned away all reason. At their head marched Marcus Croft, his face a granite mask of grief and vengeance, his certainty a torch held higher and hotter than any other. Inside the small cabin nestled in a hidden clearing, Ben knew nothing of the approaching storm. The world outside, with its noise and its hate, had faded away. Here there was only the scent of cedar shavings and the quiet, focused scrape of his knife against wood. He was finishing his gift for Amelia. It was a carving of two hands, one large and rough, the other small and slender, cupped together to hold a single perfect wildflower. It was a conversation, a thank you, a hope. He worked with a gentle, profound concentration, his massive shoulders hunched over the delicate object, a mountain sheltering a butterfly. He was so lost in his work that he almost missed it. A sound. Not the familiar whisper of the wind or the chatter of a squirrel. It was a human sound, a shout, distant and sharp, carried on the night air. He went still, his knife poised over the wood. He tilted his head, listening. There it was again, closer this time, a chorus of angry voices punctuated by the crackle of open flames. A cold knot of dread, old and sickeningly familiar, tightened in his stomach. They were coming. He didn't know why, but he knew the sound. It was the sound of a hunt, and he had always been the prey. He scrambled to his small window, peering out. The sight that met his eyes was his oldest and deepest nightmare made real. A ring of fire surrounded his clearing, dozens of torches held aloft by men whose faces were twisted into masks of hate. They were looking at his home. They were looking for him. "Beast," a voice roared. It was Croft. "We know you're in there. We know you have my son." My son. Ben's mind reeled in confusion. A child, he hadn't seen a child in days. Send the boy out, or by God we'll burn this cabin to the ground with you in it. "Give us the boy, you devil!" Another voice screamed. The accusations rained down on him, a hail of words he didn't understand. But he understood the look in their eyes. He understood the rifles. He understood the fire. This was not a misunderstanding to be talked through. This was a sentence to be carried out. Panic, raw and absolute, seized him. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. His sanctuary had become a trap. His instinct was not to fight his own strength, terrified him more than they did. His instinct was to hide, to disappear, an impossible task for a man his size. He looked wildly around the small room, and his eyes fell on his heavy workbench, a solid slab of oak. With a guttural cry of pure terror, he shoved it with all his might, scraping it across the floorboards until it slammed against the inside of his cabin door. He barricaded himself in. From the edge of the clearing, hidden in the deep shadows of an ancient cedar, Amelia watched her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a sob. She had followed them, her heart a frantic prayer with every step. She saw the ring of torches. She heard the terrible false accusations. And she saw the light in Ben's window disappear as he barricaded the door. A groan of despair went through the mob. He's locking himself in. He has the boy. He's a cornered animal. To Ben, it was an act of fear. To them, it was an admission of guilt. Croft raised his arm. "He won't listen to reason. We'll take the door down." 4 men, spurred on by his command, hoisted a fallen log onto their shoulders, turning it into a makeshift battering ram. They took their positions, aiming for the center of the simple plank door. Amelia's world narrowed to that single, terrible image, the terrified innocent man trapped inside and the blind, furious justice about to crash down upon him. She was too far, too small, too late. The men holding the log surged forward. 1, Croft, bellowed, his voice echoing through the clearing. 2, the men took another running step, muscles straining. 3, the log slammed against the door. The sound was not a crack, but a deep, sickening thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the forest. A sound like a coffin being nailed shut, and inside Ben cowered, waiting for the world to end. Thud. The world was reduced to the splintering of wood and the roaring in Ben's ears. He was pressed into the far corner of his cabin, trying to make his massive frame as small as possible, a futile gesture. He had nowhere to run. The heavy workbench shuddered with each blow from the outside, inching closer to him across the floor. They were coming through the door. They were coming to kill him. Thud. A crack, appeared a jagged lightning strike down the center of the plank door. Torchlight flickered through it, and he could see the distorted, screaming faces of the men outside their features, twisted into masks of righteousness. They were a force of nature, a wildfire of hate, and he was the dry timber in its path. One more, Croft's voice boomed a command for execution. "Bring it down!" The men with the log took a few steps back, gathering momentum for the final shattering blow. Ben squeezed his eyes shut. He saw a flash of his own hands calloused and huge, and he was terrified of what they might do if these men reached him. He was terrified of the strength he had spent a lifetime trying to contain. Then a sound. A new sound. Not a shout of rage, but a small, clear voice, thin and high, and utterly out of place. "Pa, what are you doing?" The motion outside stopped. The roaring of the mob died into an abrupt, shocked silence so complete it was a physical force. The men holding the log lowered it, confusion replacing the bloodlust on their faces. Every head turned. From the edge of the woods on the far side of the clearing, a small figure emerged. It was Daniel Croft. His shirt was torn, and his face was smeared with dirt, but his legs were steady and his eyes were wide with confusion, not terror. He was holding something in his small fist. He looked at the scene before him, the ring of men, the torches, the battering ram aimed at the cabin of the man who had just saved him. Daniel Croft's voice was a choked, disbelieving gasp. He dropped his rifle and ran to his son, grabbing him, turning him over, checking for wounds, for blood, for the marks of the monster. "My boy, are you hurt? Did that beast touch you?" Daniel shook his head, looking past his father toward the broken cabin door. The sad man, he asked, his brow furrowed. "No, Pa. I was chasing a rabbit and I fell and I got lost. I was crying." He unfurled his hand to show his father what he was clutching. "He found me. He gave me this so I wouldn't be scared." Resting in the boy's grimy palm was a small, perfectly carved wolf. Its head was tilted up, its wooden mouth open in a silent, lonely howl. The world went still. The wind in the pines seemed to hold its breath. The men of North Pine stared at the toy, this impossible, delicate truth, and then at their own heavy, brutal weapons. The log lay in the dirt like a fallen idol. The torches suddenly seemed to be burning nothing but their own shame. They had been ready to commit murder for a crime that had never happened. The beast they were hunting had been a protector. Into that vast, echoing silence, a new voice spoke, quiet but sharp as a needle. Amelia. She stepped from the shadows of the forest into the torchlight, her small frame radiating a strength that dwarfed every man there. She did not look at Croft. She looked at the faces of the mob, at the men she knew. "This," she said, her voice clear and ringing, with an authority they had never heard from her before, "is the monster you hunt." She held up the small carved bird she now carried in her pocket, its wings poised for flight. She walked into the center of the clearing, holding the bird as if it were a lantern in the dark. A monster who spends his nights carving gifts for lonely children. A monster whose first instinct upon finding a lost and crying boy is not to harm, but to comfort. Her gaze swept over them, and one by one they looked away, unable to meet her eyes. You were so eager for a monster to blame that you couldn't see the good man living right beside you. You let your fear build a cage not for him, but for your own hearts. She took a deep breath, her voice softening with a profound, aching sadness. The only monster in this clearing tonight was the one we made ourselves. Her words fell into the silence, and the silence was their answer. The men lowered their torches. They looked at their boots, at the dirt anywhere, but at each other or at the cabin. The fire of their rage had been extinguished, leaving behind the cold gray ash of shame. Croft stared at his son, then at the wolf in his son's hand, then at the cabin door, his face a ruin of disbelief and humiliation. From inside the cabin a sound, a low, heavy scraping. It was the sound of the workbench, the barricade being slowly, hesitantly dragged away from the door. He had heard them. He had heard everything. And now the door was about to open. The silence that fell upon the clearing was heavier than any stone. It was a silence filled with the weight of shame of a terrible truth revealed. The men of North Pine, who had marched into the woods as a righteous army, now stood as a scattered, defeated rabble, their torches sputtering at their feet. They could not look at the small boy clutching his wooden wolf. They could not look at the brave woman who had held a mirror up to their souls. And they could not look at the cabin door. A low, grating sound broke the stillness. It was the sound of the heavy workbench being dragged away from the door. A moment later, the door itself creaked open. Ben emerged. He did not burst out with rage, nor did he shrink back in terror. He simply stepped into the dying torchlight, his massive frame weary, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful confusion. He looked at the sea of faces that had moments before wished him dead, and his expression was not one of anger, but of a profound, heartbreaking sadness. That was what broke them completely. One by one they turned away. Croft, his face ashen, took his son's hand and melted into the darkness without a word. The others followed a slow, shame-faced retreat until the clearing was empty, save for the dying fires and the two souls who had stood against them. Ben stood alone, a giant surrounded by the ghosts of their hatred. He watched them go, his shoulders slumped, the tension draining out of him, leaving him looking smaller, more vulnerable than Amelia had ever seen him. She walked toward him, then her steps sure and steady on the soft pine needles. The space between the town and the forest no longer seemed like a border. She stopped a few feet from him. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty. It was waiting. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, rough thing, rusty from disuse. They thought I... He couldn't finish the sentence, the horror of it too great to name. They were wrong, Ben Amelia said softly, her voice a balm on the raw wound of the night. They were afraid, and fear makes people blind. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a gratitude so immense it was a silent prayer. The shirt he rasped the word, a confession. It was a good mend. Amelia smiled, a true, radiant smile. I'm a seamstress. It's what I do. He gave a small, hesitant nod, then turned and disappeared back into the darkness of his cabin. For a heart-stopping moment, Amelia thought he was retreating from her back into his world of solitude. But he emerged a moment later holding something in his cupped hands. It was the carving he'd been working on. He held it out to her. It was a sculpture of two hands. One was huge and rough-hewn, clearly a man's. The other was small and slender, and cupped between them, protected and cherished, was a single intricately detailed wild flower. This, he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. This is for you. Amelia took it, her fingers so small against his brushed his palm as she accepted the gift. The wood was smooth and warm. She traced the lines of the carving, understanding its silent, beautiful language. It was a story of strength and gentleness, of protection, of a shared, secret kindness. She looked up at him, at this giant of a man who had only ever wanted to create beautiful things. The last of her own lonely walls crumbled. She reached out and placed her small hand on his massive forearm. His muscles tensed at the unexpected touch, then relaxed to slow surrender. Ben, she whispered, you don't have to speak in wood and shadows anymore. She looked from the carving in her hand to his hopeful, frightened eyes. You can have a home, not just a cabin, a real home. The first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the pines, chasing away the last of the night's long shadows. It illuminated the clearing in a clean new light. Ben looked down at her small hand resting on his arm, then back at her face, and for the first time a slow, wondrous smile spread across his features, transforming him. The monster was gone. The sad man was gone. There was only Ben, and he was not alone anymore. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty. It was waiting. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, rough thing, rusty from disuse. They thought He couldn't finish the sentence, the horror of it too great to name. "They were wrong," Amelia said softly, her voice a balm on the raw wound of the night. "They were afraid. And fear makes people blind." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a gratitude so immense it was a silent prayer. The shirt he rasped the word a confession. It was a good mend. Amelia smiled a true, radiant smile. "I'm a seamstress. It's what I do." He gave a small hesitant nod, then turned and disappeared back into the darkness of his cabin. For a heart-stopping moment, Amelia thought he was retreating from her back into his world of solitude. But he emerged a moment later holding something in his cupped hands. It was the carving he had been working on. He held it out to her. It was a sculpture of two hands. One was huge and rough-hewn, clearly a man's. The other was small and slender, and cupped between them, protected and cherished, was a single, intricately detailed wildflower. "This," he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion, "this is for you." Amelia took it. Her fingers, so small against his, brushed his palm as she accepted the gift. The wood was smooth and warm. She traced the lines of the carving, understanding its silent, beautiful language. It was a story of strength and gentleness, of protection, of a shared secret kindness. She looked up at him, at this giant of a man who had only ever wanted to create beautiful things. The last of her own lonely walls crumbled. She reached out and placed her small hand on his massive forearm. His muscles tensed at the unexpected touch, then relaxed a slow surrender. "Ben," she whispered, "you don't have to speak in wood and shadows anymore." She looked from the carving in her hand to his hopeful, frightened eyes. "You can have a home. Not just a cabin. A real home." The first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the pines, chasing away the last of the night's long shadows. It illuminated the clearing in a clean, new light. Ben looked down at her small hand resting on his arm, then back at her face, and for the first time a slow, wondrous smile spread across his features, transforming him. The monster was gone. The sad man was gone. There was only Ben, and he was not alone anymore.